Hi, my name's Ben Hales, and this is the third in an exclusive series of videos for TournamentPokerEdge.com. In this third video, I'm going to be continuing discussing the HUD statistics. Garotta, on the other hand, in this hand, in the bottom left, he has a c-bet percentage of only 42%, despite all his other stats looking normal. This is a clear indication that this player has a quirk. He doesn't c-bet unless he has something. So you should pounce on weakness and fold to strength, as his c-bet is always going to be telling you the truth about the strength of his hand. Valuable information indeed. I'll be looking more at c-betting when I discuss reports in the next video in this series. The fold to c-bet stat, which is the percentage of time a player folds when faced by a continuation bet, is a very valuable stat if you have enough sample size. You're going to want about 1,000 hands before this becomes reliable. My colour boundaries for this are set to 40, 5 and 58. Once again, I want to highlight extremes, players who I can exploit. Someone is folding more than 58% of the time to a c-bet, I'm going to make that bet. If someone is folding less than 45% of the time to a c-bet, I'm not going to go bluffing into a calling station. It's pretty straightforward, this one, but once again, use the VPIP and preflop raise stats too to build an overall picture of your opponent. I'm going to pick on a supernova player I know called Chobo Poker, who you can see at this table. As you can see, he's a very tight player, and his fold to c-bet percentage is too high at 72%. I'm going to assume that this player is only seeing turn and river cards if he's holding a big hand. I'm certainly going to be c-betting into him 100% of the time, and being extremely cautious if he sticks around in a hand. The other extreme is a player like I.M. Pronin, who you can see here in the top right, is also a very tight player. I'm tempting to pick out decent players for these stats now, as to beat the fish you only need to use the core stats. To beat these good players, you need to be looking in more depth at the stats. I.M. Pronin plays good hands only, but when he sees a flop, he does not like folding, regardless of his position. A player who has a fold to c-bet percentage of 24 should not be bluffed into, so if you miss the flop, don't c-bet. The third stat on the bottom row of my HUD is went to showdown percentage when saw flop. This is exactly what it says it is. You can really be helped by this stat. It helps you to identify how fishy a player is, and you can use it in close conjunction with the following stat, won showdown percentage. The went to showdown percentage normal boundaries for 6-max are a bit higher than for full ring. I think between 25 and 39 is normal for the games I play, though 20 to 32 are the conventional boundaries. It's a useful figure for knowing how likely your opponent is to fold post-flop to a bet or a raise, and so you can look at it when considering a bluff. Low numbers are good to bluff into, and high numbers not so good. Exploiting players with high went to showdown percentages depends a lot on their other stats. I'm going to talk some more about this later, but for now, if you see a player with a high VPIP and high went to showdown stats, you can assume you have a loose calling station, and you can beat this player with straightforward poker, betting for value when strong. Obviously, if a player has a went to showdown percentage of less than 25, or perhaps less than 20 on full ring games, this is a player you can bluff into a lot post-flop to force them off winning hands. The won showdown percentage is the percentage of times a player wins at showdown, and you will need a large sized sample of 1,000 hands or so before taking this into consideration. Clearly, greater than 50% is a good number. I've just set one colour boundary for this stat, so anyone at less than 45% appears in green, and I know that they often go to showdown behind. Everyone else is in orange. What you're really looking at here is the relationship between the went to showdown percentage and the won showdown percentage. If the first figure is low and the second is high, you have a good, solid winning player. If the inverse is true, and the first figure is high and the second is low, you have a fish who you can exploit post-flop. Hold'em Manager 2 has a few other showdown stats which you can access on the pop-up box. One when saw flop is quite nice, telling you what percentage of time a player wins a hand when he sees a flop. For tight pre-flop players this should be quite high, and for lags like myself anything over 40% is okay. Remember though, don't spend too much time with these stats for players with whom you have played less than 1,000 hands. These figures just won't mean much and might mislead you. The next stat that I want to look at is the flop donk bet stat. A donk bet is the widely used term for a lead out bet from a player defending a hand out of position, typically sat on the blinds betting at the pre-flop raiser. A donk bet is not always a bad bet, but usually it's the wrong thing to do. On the flop in particular, it's a strange thing to do, as normally a check call or check raise is going to be the smart play. So the donk bet ranges I use are, as you can see here, 5% to 20% normal, and then anyone doing this more than 1 in 5 times is going to be in green. I also have a purple zone here for habitual donk betters. It helps to be able to see this stat stand out. My own flop donk bet stat is 8%, and I think this is about right. You should consider donk betting to steal pots from very tight players who are going to respect your bet. I often find a check raise works a higher percentage of the time, but a lot depends on stack sizes. You want to choose flops which you might have hit that the raiser is likely to have missed, for example, low cards or paired boards. The other times I like to donk bet are when I'm genuinely strong in a multi-way pot and the board is quite draw heavy, or I'm holding bottom 2 pair. So if you're playing and someone donk bets into you, you can quickly see whether or not this is a bet you should respect or not by this stat. If it's me donk betting into you, you're probably going to want to fold, and if it's someone with 20% or more betting into you, you might want to consider calling, raising or folding, depending on the board, your hole cards, your situation. As usual, it's the extremes that give you the most useful information. The penultimate stat on the bottom row of my HUD is a very specific stat, and as a result you need about 500 hands or so before you can use it. It's called the flop check raise out of position, which of course refers to the percentage of time a player chooses to check raise the flop when he's sat out of position. I set my normal colour boundaries for this from 3 to 12%. My own stat is a wild 10%, as this is a favourite move of mine in certain spots. The advantage of seeing this stat is that when a player check raises the flop, you can quickly see whether or not this is likely to be the extremely strong hand it represents. Generally, when a player check raises, you ought to be folding, unless you have a good reason not to. But if that player check raises a high percentage of the time, there's a good chance he's bluffing or semi-bluffing. So then you're in a tough spot, and often you will still need to fold or perhaps try a re-raise. In this hand, my opponent is a winning regular with solid core stats, who has an identical flop check raise percentage to me, so I know he likes to use this as a bluffing or semi-bluffing weapon, in a similar kind of way that I would do. The board, I'll just show you the board. It's a classic board to check raise. There's no real high cards for the raiser's hand and no obvious draws. All in all, there's a really high percentage chance that the raiser has missed the flop completely and will fold to a check raise. As a result, I expect his check raise here to be a bluff. He's probably looking to steal a hand and he knows I'm a fairly respectful player. In response, I don't want to flat call with my hand, as any overcards that drop are going to give me a problem, and I won't know where I'm at for the rest of the hand, as he's taken over control of the betting with his raise. So a re-raise now really asks him a clear question: have you got a 10 or better, or not? And most of the time, the answer will be no. If he calls, that's the end of my hand, unless I spike a 6 on the turn. The final stat on my HUD is a really important one, and one that is often considered the third most important after VPIP and preflop raise. Postflop aggression factor is a key stat, which is often ignored, misunderstood, or used inappropriately. So I'm going to explain exactly what it is and how to use it properly. This stat measures how aggressive a player is post-flop by dividing the number of times a player bets or raises post-flop by the number of times he calls or checks. In essence, it is a ratio of aggressive to passive actions. The higher the number, the more aggressive the player is. A typical winning player will have an aggression factor of between 1.8 and 3.5, though it is possible to be a winning player outside of this zone. As you can see, my red, orange and green are set up to reflect that, with the additional pink colour there to draw my attention to any super aggressive post-flop players, and there are plenty of them out there. My biggest piece of advice when looking at aggression factor is not to look at it in isolation. It's a great stat and it does help a lot, but you have to look at it in conjunction with VPIP and preflop raise. Let me look at a few different players so you can make sense of the numbers. At this table, I can see Pooh67 with a very loose preflop strategy and a bunch of other wild stats, yet a very defensive post-flop aggression factor. This player is a fish who plays very aggressively pre-flop but won't put hands down. The way to exploit this player is to play a tight range pre-flop and to make value bets post-flop. You should also fold against any post-flop aggression from this player, as that will be genuine strength. My own post-flop aggression is normal at 2.4. I have a good balance of aggression, defense, and deception, and it's really not easy to find an obvious way to exploit a player whose stats are in orange. Gil Senna below me appears to be an overly aggressive fish based on the 43 hands I have available. This player might put you in some difficult spots, but a normal tag style will generally succeed against this type of player. If you hit a big hand, consider checking and allowing the over-aggressive player to throw chips at you rather than scaring them off with bets. Racy Rose is a classic mouse with a passive, loose passive pre-flop style coupled with a weak passive post-flop game signaled by the 1.7 aggression factor. This player can be exploited easily by seeing flops with him, preferably in position, and then applying post-flop pressure, which this player won't enjoy. Usually, just keep nibbling away with lots of post-flop bets. If this player raises or shows aggression, you should read that as extreme strength and fold. In the top left-hand corner, Shasta Visa is a tight aggressive regular with an aggression factor of 3.1. This is higher than average, but is probably about right for a player with such tight preflop stats. A super tight preflop player will probably have an aggression factor of over 4, and that would be okay too. The looser you are pre-flop, the lower your aggression factor is likely to be. So what you should really be looking for are those who don't fit the pattern. I can't really exploit Shasta Visa's aggression factor at all. I'm now going to pick on a few individual players with abnormal aggression factors, so you know what to look for. If you look down at the bottom at the player Jack McPhee, this player is quite unusual. in that he plays very tight pre-flop, yet his aggression factor post-flop is incredibly low at 0.9. His name is quite ironic, as it seems to me that he's the one who's afraid to put money into the pot. The temptation with this type of player is to bully them pre-flop and post-flop, and to an extent that's exactly what you should do. But if he's calling post-flop, you should tend to stop betting, as this is not your standard mouse. Think in terms of hand ranges. His range is tight, so if he's still involved post-flop, he's probably very strong. Satisfy yourself with stealing his blinds whenever possible and c-betting into him when you get the chance. Now take a look at M Psycho on this table. I was looking quickly for an example of an ultra-aggressive post-flop player, and this was the closest fit I could find. You'll see players with aggression factors in double figures, which is insane. But when this player raises or bets post-flop, that is not an indication of strength, it's just the way he plays. Look at his went to showdown stats at 19%. This is entirely understandable for a player this aggressive. He is shutting down hands on the flop and turn before hands go to showdown. This low figure indicates that he himself will fold if counter-aggression is shown. So when appropriate, you should be prepared to re-raise this player to knock him off the hand. If you hold a really strong hand, you should tend to slow play into players like this. They're going to throw chips at you, so just sit back and let them do the betting for you. It can be a huge mistake to lead out of players like this, as you can sometimes make them fold their weak hands when what you really want them to do is bluff into you. Now I want to talk briefly about the relationship between the went to showdown stat and the aggression factor stat. M Psycho has a low went to showdown percentage of just 19, which suggests he is successfully betting enough to prevent players from calling on draws. Look at Koitja 60 at the bottom here on this table. He has a went to showdown percentage of 44% and a high aggression factor. You can also see the don't bet stat is 57% and a host of other indicators that this player is a fish. But why is this player going to showdown so often if he's so aggressive? The answer lies in two things. Firstly, his tendency to limp pre-flop, playing a large percentage of small pots. And secondly, his bet sizing. His bet sizes will often be too small to make opponents fold. His table image won't help either if opponents know how often he loses money at showdown. You can see here he wins just 38% of the time. You don't have to do anything too special to exploit this player. ABC Poker will do just fine, though I personally would try to see lots of flops with him, as I fancy exploiting his post-flop weaknesses. You can simply see cheap flops, wait until you hit something big, and wait for the fish to throw money your way. Remember that unless they have a super tight pre-flop strategy, a player with a high went to showdown percentage is probably not hitting the fold button enough. Take a look at Mouse on this table. This player has a very high went to showdown percentage of 51%, but a very low aggression factor of just 0.8%. This is your classic indicator of a calling station. You ought to know by now how to exploit calling stations. You value bet into them, never bluff into them, and accept that from time to time you will get sucked out on. Unavoidable. But these players can be milked for lots and lots of chips in the long run. So that completes my analysis of some of the most vital HUD stats. You should now feel confident about what they all mean. You should have a feel for the kind of normal boundaries each stat has. I'm not suggesting my boundaries are gospel by any means. Remember, they need to befit the tournaments that you play. You should also be able to build a picture of each opponent based on their stats, and you should have an idea as to how you can exploit any weaknesses they may have. I now want to briefly mention a few of the other thousands of stats you might consider using on Hold'em Manager 2. Returning to the HUD options screen and displayed stats, in the miscellaneous section here, you'll notice a stat called win rate. Win rate is measured by how many big blinds per 100 hands a player wins, so it's quite an accurate measure of how successful a player is. If you're not sure from your other stats whether a player is winning or losing, this stat is useful, and many players include it on their HUD. The drawback for me is that you need a few thousand hands before you can read much into it, and if you really want to know, you might be better off using a data mining site. The last stat on there, the won hands percentage, tells you what percentage of hands a player wins at the table. I find this stat can be quite misleading, as super type players will have a very low percentage, but might still be very profitable. Often the best players don't have a particularly high percentage of won hands, as they simply play more carefully, especially on low and medium stakes. Nevertheless, it's an interesting stat and one you might want to be aware of. You'll notice the versus hero stats here. It's a new feature in Hold'em Manager 2. They're great for analysing how regulars play against you. I don't recommend them for your HUD. You're simply not going to have enough sample size to justify their inclusion. If I open the VPIP drop-down arrow here, you'll see the various in-depth VPIP stats available. You can include these on your pop-up box. You don't really need them on your HUD. I do think breaking VPIP and preflop raise down by position is extremely useful. It's by far the most common reason I open my pop-up boxes when playing. But if you're not a fan of pop-up boxes and you do like this information, you might conceivably want to pop them onto your HUD. Cold call here, total cold call raiser. That's a stat a lot of players like to put on their HUDs. You can more or less judge what the stat's going to be by looking at your opponent's other stats. But if you use this, you get a fix on a player's calling range. Be very wary though. Players will cold call much more frequently from the big blind. So you do have to take position into consideration when looking at this stat. You might, in fact, want a range of different ones broken down by position. I personally, I'm happy to use the other stats to get a fix on this, but lots of players like this one. Any player calling 20% of the time or more is going to be really, really loose, and something like 5%, I guess, would be pretty tight. Total squeeze, it's quite a nice stat. It represents the percentage of time a player makes a squeeze play when he has the opportunity. I notice some very tight players have high squeeze percentages as they're good players looking for good value from the blinds. A lot of average strength players don't really understand the benefits of squeeze plays, so they have squeeze percentages far too low. If I see a player with a low percentage making a squeeze play, I know he'll be holding a genuine hand, whereas I'm much more suspicious of a player who squeezes regularly. In the flop bet section here, I like the percentage fold to check raise, which tells you how likely a player is to respect your check raise on the flop. Because I like to check raise on the flop, this is something that appeals to me to see how likely it is to work. As with all these specific stats though, you're going to want a fair sample size before you can really use it. The flop versus bet section contains some similarly interesting stats on what players do when facing a bet on the flop. If they're out of position, it's quite nice to know how often they're going to check fold, how often they're going to check call, or how often they're going to check raise. All of these stats are available here, and you could add them to your HUD pop-up box or indeed to your HUD. Under continuation bet here, you'll see the flop C bet, the most important one, which is already on the HUD. but also there's a turn c-bet, more commonly known as a double barrel. You'll also find a river c-bet or triple barrel. Knowing how often a player will fire again on the turn might help you to decide whether to float a hand on the flop, so this stat is a very popular one amongst players. If I open the aggression section, you'll see there are actually two measurements of aggression, not just the aggression factor that I discussed in depth earlier. You might want to simply build a pop-up box for aggression factor with the flop, turn and river breakdowns. Players often play very differently on the different streets, and this can help you with your decisions. I should mention that aggression percentage is also a very popular stat, but without going into detail, I consider it to be a poor alternative to aggression factor. Finally, the river bets drop-down arrow contains specific information on how a player will react on the river. Again, you'll need a fair sample size before this becomes useful, but if you have got a few thousand hands on an opponent, you might like to know how likely he is to check fold or check call, check raise if you make a bet on the river. Again, this can be incorporated on a pop-up box if you're not comfortable having so many stats on your HUD. Of course, I could go on a lot longer, but I think that covers the most frequently used Hold'em Manager 2 stats. Most players, when they start using a HUD for the first time, choose 3 or 4 stats just to get used to it. You can then start building them up as you go along. Also, make sure you delete any stats on your HUD that you're simply not using. To conclude this video, I want to simply bring up a few tables and go around the table profiling a few of the opponents using the skills which I've taught. This is what you should now be able to do. Because I'm running out of time, I'm just going to do this for the one table. Chris D23 in the top right hand corner. We've only got 32 hands on him, so only looking at pre-flop raise and VPIP, and from the first few hands he looks as though he's probably going to be a fish who's very loose, limping into pots. Not raised an awful lot, but we're not going to overjudge these stats at all because we only have 32 hands. At the bottom, Grand Sick, we have 291 hands, and this player has normal, loose aggressive, VPIP and pre-flop raise statistics, but very high 3-bet stats. So definitely going to keep an eye on his 3-betting. The 15 in red indicates that this player has very little positional awareness. He's stealing only 15% of the time, even though his 16 pre-flop raise, really he ought to be stealing 25-30% of the time. So let's have a look if we're right by clicking into his pre-flop raise stats in more detail, and you can see there's no indication that this player is positionally aware. The pre-flop raises are fairly random, a few more coming in from the cutoff, but the VPIP stats as well are all over the place. There's no real positional awareness going on here. Folding on the blinds, fairly normal. Went to showdown a little bit high. He is winning when he goes to showdown a reasonable amount, which suggests this player is not doing too badly despite some strange stats. The 4.5 is his aggression factor, and that's really high. So post flop, we're looking at a loose aggressive player who's overly aggressive post flop and who may well throw chips at you. So probably just want to be playing ABC poker against him, and that should be successful. Pesterer, 126 hands on this player, and he plays half of them. So a VPIP of 50% indicates this player is probably a fish. His pre-flop raise range is much more normal at 16, so when he raises, you must still give him some respect. 3-bet starts very, very low, so when he 3-bets, you should respect that. And from what we've got, not many hands probably, but 40 for folding off the big blind, which suggests that he is a calling station. The very low aggression factor at the end there, 1.2, is also indicative of a calling station. He's very, very weak and passive post-flop. The type of player who you need to bet into regularly and value bet into. The player above him, whose name I'm not going to attempt to say, we have 441 hands on, and again he's got fairly normal pre-flop VPIP and pre-flop raise. His VPIP is a bit loose, but it's not terrible. Got the mouse symbol indicating that he's a mouse. He's not a big mouse. His post-flop aggression factor 1.8 indicates that he is a bit weak, a bit passive, but it's not overly weak. It's in orange. It's not a crazy statistic, but he is a little bit passive. You can see 1.0 3 betting, 80% folding to 3 bets, folds a lot from the small blind, fold to steal, big blind, fold to steal. So quite passive. Doesn't c-bet properly. C-bet's only 46% of the time, so it's very predictable poker. Only betting when he's got a piece of the flop. 58% fold to c-bet. Okay, that's not too awful. So all in all, you know, this player is a little bit of a mousy, passive type of player, but not hugely. So you should value bet into him and try and knock him around a little bit. But when he shows strength, then he should be folding. The player above him, Shave Bost, is we've got a few hands on him. 1.7 thousand, so 1,700, and a tight player, 18 and 17. This player is probably winning on these stake levels. He's got a nice set of orange statistics there. He folds very regularly from the blinds, so we should be attempting to steal from him when we get the opportunity. He's going to be folding a lot pre-flop, so when he gets involved, we know he's likely to have a decent hand. Knowing his hand range is quite narrow pre-flop does help to avoid trouble against this player post-flop. Went to showdowns quite high, which is fairly normal for such a pre-flop tight player. He wins a lot of hands at showdown, 56%, which suggests this is a winning player. Aggression factor matches his tightness pre-flop. It's not overly aggressive at 3.0. It's actually probably ideal. So, you know, no donk betting whatsoever. All the hallmarks here of quite a smart, tight, aggressive player. And that completes my analysis of this table. That completes the third video in this series. In my next video, I'll be discussing Hold'em Manager 2 reports. My name's Ben Hales, and you can see my details at tournamentpokeredge.com. Thank you for listening.